picture yourself like a top of Mount Kilimanjaro, up there, kind of the top of the world. Like, so from like that bird's eye view, when you look down at the planet in 2025 as a political ecologist, like what's your assessment?
We're all screwed. I mean, to put it bluntly, yeah. There's just, I mean, as you know, as everyone knows, if anyone who's listening, it's pretty seriously chaotic out there right now, and there's a lot of scary things happening.
Hello and welcome to the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Baumeister. With me today is a good friend, someone who's like myself, an American stranded on the European continent, Sierra Deutsch. How you doing, Sierra?
I'm doing good, David. How are you?
Can't complain. Yeah. I like the peace of this time of the year, like early fall, late summer. It's can be kind of a quiet transitional period. So, why don't you just describe who you are? Why are you stranded in Europe, and what do you do here?
Yeah, I always have the hardest time with this question because I'm so undisciplined, meaning like scholarly disciplined. I have so many interests that I don't know, it's really hard to describe what I do exactly. So the way I've started describing my path, I guess, is that I've spent my career trying to understand social and environmental problems from multiple lenses and multiple angles. So from biology to women's studies to now geography, sociology, and now I would consider myself a political ecologist. And basically coming at these ideas from a political economy perspective, but also focused more now on solutions. So doing solution-oriented work and working specifically with people outside of academia as well, to sort of collaborate on knowledge production and finding solutions together.
I know for a fact that you were just somewhere very unique, doing something quite special. What were you doing and where were you?
So I was climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, the tallest mountain in Africa and the tallest standalone mountain in the world. And
nice.
And that was on the heels of a conference that I went to in Johannesburg.
So kind of built in, it was kind of like a work play vacation, or one of those where it's like if you're already in a nice place, so you can put in some recreational time.
Exactly. Yeah. And Kilimanjaro has been something I've been wanting to do for all of my adult life and probably much of my childhood as well. So it was kind of a trip of a lifetime that just randomly happened. And it wasn't like a big plan to go and do it. It was just like, oh, here's my opportunity. I'm just going to do it.
Yes. I mean, so many questions about what it was like what, let me start with this. Like, did it meet your expectations, given that this is something that was like kind of on your bucket list or that you were interested in? How did the reality compare with your kind of imagination?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess in some ways, yeah, it exceeded my expectations, but in others, it was a little outside of my expectations. Like, for example, when I first looked into it, like 25 years ago, you would have to take a ranger with you for the first couple of days because there was some concern that there would be issues with lions or buffalo or other wild animals. And that's not necessary anymore because these animals are not found in that part of the park anymore.
Okay.
So that was one of the things that really excited me about climbing Kilimanjaro in the first place, was this opportunity to be potentially so close to these wild animals.
But that's not the Kilimanjaro we have anymore.
Not anymore. No, we saw buffalo footprints and one buffalo carcass, but that was the extent of the big wildlife that we saw.
Okay. Wow. Is this because of like poaching or overdevelopment, or like tourism and over tourism, or like what accounts for the?
I mean, I couldn't say for sure. I didn't. I didn't like look into it specifically, but when I asked them, they did say it was because they stay away from people. So I'm assuming that it's from over tourism, that there's just so many people in the area now that it's not worth coming in the area to encounter humans.
Okay. So they know that it's in their best interests.
Yeah.
And keep away.
Exactly.
Oh man.
Yeah. And the other thing was that it was much more, I guess, comfortable than I expected. It was, I don't know how to explain it. Like, so I had my own tent, and it was a 2-person tent. And, and it also had like a whole porch area that was half of the tent as well. And that's like where I had all my meals and coffee and tea. And like, they were constantly bringing hot water, hot coffee, hot tea, soup. I had a hot water bottle to sleep with my feet, or to put at my feet at night to sleep with. And
nice. I mean, that sounds kind of like a luxury treatment.
It kind of felt a bit like glamping, which was not my expectation of climbing the highest mountain in Africa at all. I think I was expecting it to be a bit more rugged and more challenging in that aspect.
Okay. But how did it compare in terms of just like mountaineering, mountain climbing difficulty or detail to other mountains that you've climbed in the past?
Yeah, difficulty wise, I think I took, there's lots of different routes you can take. So I signed up for a 9-day Northern Circuit route with a stay in Crater Camp after the summit. So Crater Camp is it's only about 100 meters below the summit. And so a lot of people don't stay there. They immediately come back down. So it's it's unusual for people to stay that high. So that took an extra night as well. But I ended up doing it in 7 days because I was going a bit faster than I think the guides anticipated.
Okay. They're kind of not used to like someone just coming in kind of, it's not their first rodeo.
I guess they're prepared not, for everything. Which is really, like, you would think that people would want to be pretty prepared for this kind of an undertaking. But so those first few days up until the summit night, they call it summit night because most people start the summit in the middle of the night. So those first few days were pretty normal for me. They were not particularly challenging. They were fine. And we were hiking maybe 15 to 16 kilometers per day. And of course, I was a bit tired at the end of the day, but other than that, it felt like normal places that I've been to. But the summit day was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life.
Oh, damn. Okay.
So it was, so most people they wake up at midnight to do the summit. And that's
because of the temperature, so they get up there before it gets too hot, or what's the
No, it's actually really cold. It's freezing cold.
Okay.
So like once you're up at that altitude, it's in the negatives.
Okay.
And it's windy, and so the summit is at 5,895 meters.
Okay. That's a lot of meters.
And and you sleep I think most people sleep close to 4,000 meters the night of the summit, maybe a little bit higher depending on the camp you stay at. And so most people get up at midnight, and there's several reasons they want you to summit. First, because you end up summiting around sunrise when you do that. So the hike is 6 to 7 hours to the summit.
I mean, isn't it more dangerous though, because it's dark? Like you'd think
you think, but the thing is, like, basically, so this was part of what was so challenging, is the hike straight up is just through scree. So like this loose volcanic rock. So there's not you can't really like fall over things or stumble over them because you're basically just stepping up and sliding slightly back and then stepping up and sliding slightly back. And you just keep...
That sounds like frustrating. You're like Sisyphus. Your boulder keeps rolling back down, but you got to just keep going, but a little bit more each time, I guess. Yeah. Okay.
And then most people, after they get to the summit, they come all the way back down to one of the lower camps that's at like 3,800 meters or even below that. And so
they just kind of roll down.
Basically.
Like that's quite a,
No, actually the down is really difficult as well. So you've woken up at midnight, you haven't gotten much sleep, you're doing a 6 to 7 hour, hugely challenging summit. And then you're walking down again for another 6 to 8 hours, like after being exhausted from no sleep and from hiking to the summit. And so this is what I didn't want to do because downhill really hurts my body. So this is why I stayed at Crater Camp. And so I was able to leave we left at 4:30 in the morning for the summit. And then we got there around 10:30 a.m. and there was no one else there. It was just me and my guide. And so we had
so it was well timed in that regard.
Yeah,
you kind of like beat the rush or were after the rush, I guess. Yeah.
So we had the top of the mountain to ourselves and we stayed for about 30 minutes and then went to Crater Camp.
Okay. Was there some hot tea for you up there?
No, unfortunately. No,
summit?
Not for me. I heard that other tour companies do that though.
Okay. But like, what was it like up there on the summit then? Like what was the weather like that day? What did it look like? What did it feel like?
I was really lucky actually because the weather was good. It was really clear. It was sunny. It was cold, but it wasn't like it was manageable for me. And I get cold really easily. And it was just like, I actually cried when I reached the summit because I think that summit day is so incredibly challenging. Like it just takes everything you have to keep going because you're exhausted. You're in the dark for a couple of hours. When you first start moving, it's freezing cold and windy and you can't see where you're going. So you don't, like you have a goal in your head, but you don't have a goal that you're looking at. And it feels never ending because you're just walking, sliding back, walking, sliding back.
Have you been like mentally preparing yourself for it though? Kind of knowing that that's coming up, or was it more of a surprise?
Yeah, a bit. Yeah. But the thing I was most scared of was getting altitude sickness. Okay. Because that's something you can't control. You can't really do anything about. Once you have it, you have to descend.
It just kind of gets you out. And that has to do with the air being very thin and with your blood circulation and stuff? Or
yeah, the air being very thin, which means there's not as much oxygen. So there's not enough pressure to basically push enough oxygen in your body for the oxygen to bind to your blood cells the way it normally would.
Okay.
So some people are still able to bind as much oxygen as they need at those altitudes without supplemental oxygen, and others aren't able to do that. So, and there's the science behind it has not been able to really determine what makes someone more susceptible to altitude sickness. I mean, there are certain things, but we also see that there are people who are very fit who train for months and then get altitude sickness faster than someone who's been sitting on their couch and eating hamburgers for 2 weeks before the trek. You know?
Yeah, there's so much variation in other variables, right? That it's
exactly.
Yeah. Wow. But you got lucky.
But yeah,
in this case.
Yeah, yes, I did. Although my oxygen was super low the night of Crater Camp, and I actually probably should have descended more that day, but they didn't measure my oxygen level until it was nighttime. And that day that's when the weather got pretty crazy because it was super, super windy and freezing cold. We're staying in tents and there's no one else around. It was just our 2 tents, like me in my tent and then my guide and a couple of the porters. And so I probably should have descended, but because it was dark and we had already set up camp, it was safer for me to stay put.
Okay, sure.
But my oxygen levels were 60%, which is which is considered a medical emergency usually.
Okay. Damn. And there's there's kind of nothing that you could do at that point, right? I mean, taking some additional oxygen and so I assume helps a little bit, but that just shows that you rapidly need to get to thicker air.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And that the decision was, I think, because I wasn't showing other extreme signs, like I had no appetite and I was really fatigued, but I wasn't showing the serious signs of altitude sickness, which are like confusion and just like having no idea what's going on around you and speaking gibberish and stuff like that. And because I wasn't showing those other symptoms, they decided to stay the night, check me again in the morning. And then they would give me oxygen if I needed oxygen to make the descent. So when they checked me again in the morning, I was still pretty much the same. And we decided not to do the oxygen and just go for the descent.
Mm-hmm. Probably that hot water bottle helped you that night, I bet. That was probably a good
Definitely.
one to have.
Yeah. And I brought a heated vest specifically for that night too.
Okay.
And there again, we left in the morning before the sunrise because we were trying to see the sunrise at a different part of the summit.
Okay.
So it was very, very cold with the high winds that morning.
But no precipitation up there. Like, are you too high for precipitation?
Not too high for it. It's just that this is the middle of their long dry season.
Okay.
So they don't have much rain this time of year anyway.
Okay. But a lot of wind.
There was snow there when I reached there. There's still a glacier up there as well. So I had clear views of the glacier.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, like glaciers, like the rarity, or like the we already talked a little bit about like the wildlife patterns, or maybe these like kind of extinction or human impact patterns, and like you as a political ecologist. So like again, picture yourself like a top of Mount Kilimanjaro up there, kind of the top of the world. Like, so from like that bird's eye view, when you look down at the planet in 2025 as a political ecologist, like what's your assessment?
We're all screwed. I mean, to put it bluntly, yeah. There's just, I mean, as you know, as everyone knows, anyone who's listening, it's pretty seriously chaotic out there right now, and there's a lot of scary things happening. Mm-hmm. And it was actually really nice to get away from internet and phone and email and everything for 7 days to just sort of be present. Because I think in this world, it's impossible to be present because there's just so much happening and there's so many things to worry about. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, is like, that gave me, I guess, a sense of just being able to remove myself for a bit and being able to recuperate my own energy to come back and continue working on the work that I'm doing.
I really like what you said there, or the sense of, I don't know, there's like this polycrisis of things unfolding around the planet. And it's like if we just like around the ideas of politics and ecology, or like human society and environment and the intersection, like there's problems and dynamics and things happen in other spaces too. But there, it's like if you just track the history of the planet, well, really, the last few centuries, but then the last few decades, and then even just the last 5 years, and even it seems like we're on this accelerating course of destruction, and the global political winds are blowing in the wrong direction, whereas it might maybe felt for a while that they were perhaps blown in the right direction. So things seem like they're going to get worse if there's some sort of improvement. But so it's very perilous times in terms of just the direction of where we're even going.
Yeah. And I think also because of my work, I understand it maybe a little bit differently than the average person, because to me, so I went to maybe this will help introduce what I'm talking about. I went to this session at the conference that I went to on the term polycrisis and whether it's really useful or not in sort of motivating people, and whether it's something we need to be using, or whether it's just another term that's useless, basically.
Yes.
And there were a lot of different opinions in this discussion on it. But for me, it's really helpful because the polycrisis to me they aren't just interrelated because they sort of reinforce each other and create these positive feedback loops, but also because they have the same, for me at least, the same core causes. Mm-hmm. And this is where, so one of the things I haven't mentioned yet is that my main area of critique is neoliberalism and capitalism. Mm-hmm. And so for me, when I was on this career journey of looking at environmental and social problems from all these different angles, every time I peeled back the layers of using whatever lens that I was using, capitalism was always at the core. And this colonial residue that comes with capitalism as well. So they're very intertwined as well. I've noticed that a lot of people, they recognize that they're interconnected, but not at their core. So maybe if you think of it like an aspen grove, right? We know now that aspens share a root system, and that an entire forest of aspens shares the same root system. But from above, you don't see that.
It's kind of like one super organism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And above, you do see that they interact with each other, that they're, for example, if one aspen is overshadowing another, it maybe doesn't do so well. And so you can see these surface interactions and you understand that they're interrelated as an aspen forest, but you don't see the roots. And so I think a lot of people, when they think of the polycrisis, they understand that these crises are interconnected. Like, for example, if the poles are warming up faster, that means we're going to see less biodiversity in the poles, especially, but everywhere, right? So as the planet heats up, we're seeing less biodiversity, and that impacts the people who live there as well, and it impacts the type of medicine we can produce, the types of food that are available. So we know that all of these crises are interconnected, and I think a lot of people understand that, but they don't then look deeper into what is connecting them at the root. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think my work and the work of other critical political ecologists differs from others who are working on the polycrisis.
In terms of the focus on that root.
Exactly. In terms of saying, okay, we have these interconnected crises, and what's happening at the moment is we're attacking the symptoms. We're trying to fix the symptoms of this root cause instead of really going down into the root and getting at what's in the root to prevent these symptoms from occurring in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could you give an example, maybe one from your work, or if not from your own work, one that you're aware of in the field that maybe would show to a listener or watcher the way in which different, maybe simultaneous or overlapping crises can be seen to actually kind of be rooted in that?
I don't know if there's a specific example, but the way I think about it is, I mean, going back to Marx, right? We know it from Marx's work and from many others who have followed him, or at least many of us follow Marx's argument, I would say, in that profit. So capitalism needs profit to continue growing. This is Marxist idea of value in motion, right? It's as soon as that value in motion, and value in motion it's lots of things. It's social relationships, but it's the accumulation of wealth, essentially. That's wealth moving around, cycling. I always have a difficult time explaining this because I also struggle to grasp it myself. I actually have a really horrible graphic that I show my students to try and get this across, and it's a very simplified graphic as well. But yeah, basically value. So for capitalism, this value needs to be in motion. And if it stops, if profit stops being produced somewhere along the line, then we have the stagnation of the economy. And that's when we see our huge economic crises.
And that's both at the level of individual corporations or kind of capitalist actors in the system for whom just making profit is a necessary demand, whether from shareholders, or that's just what it means to be in a profitable business. And then also a macro level of the economies nationally and internationally, whereby growth and GDP growth in particular is also demanded. So in either case,
exactly.
It's like a sort of equilibrium or point of stability is not possible. Structurally, there's this demand for more and more and more.
Yeah, exactly. And even on the small business scale, if you're not producing a profit, then you're usually either going out of business or you're selling to another bigger business. And then businesses get bigger and bigger. And this is where we see all the merges, et cetera. And so if you understand capitalism that way, then the important question is how is profit, how do we get profit? Where does profit come from? It's not just coming out of nowhere, right? It has to be coming from somewhere. And of course, Marx says that it's coming from people's labor. So their people who sell their labor are compensated a certain amount for that labor, but any labor in excess of what they're paid for goes to the pockets of the business owner in the form of profit. And that's a very early way of understanding where profit comes from. But since then, a lot of others have shown that profit also comes from exploiting the environment and not paying to clean it up, for example.
And even just like extracting natural resources, right? Or like primitive accumulation. I think Marx has some nascent idea of that, but but as you're pointing out, like these extrinsic, what do they call them? Exigencies or extrinsicies.
Yeah.
Outside, like a company can earn profit. Externalities. Yeah. But can pollute and shove costs out that aren't quantified.
Exactly.
And just being able to do that, like profit can come from this offsetting.
Exactly.
So not just internal to capitalists and proletarians, or business owners and capitalists and workers, but the environment in which they're situated as material natural beings.
Exactly. And then several other people have theorized after this based on these ideas, like David Harvey is one example. He talks about spatial temporal fixes. So basically what he says is capitalism is very adaptable. And that's why it hasn't collapsed, as Marx predicted. Right? And so what happens when we have these huge economic crises is there's some sort of a fix. And for David Harvey, these came in the forms of spatial or temporal fixes. So for example, if the labor laws are too stringent in the country in which you're running your business, then you just take some of your factories and you ship them overseas so that you can pay workers less where the labor laws are less stringent. And then you can start making profit again. So this is essentially what shut down the factories in the US, is that all of that labor went abroad because the labor laws in the US became too restrictive for capitalism to continue making a profit. And we see the same thing with environmental issues. And then the temporal fixes were credit cards, right? And these subprime mortgages. So if you can't get capital to move now today, you just put it into a credit card and you worry about what will happen in the future, or a home loan or mortgage or school loans.
Yeah, and that seems like this debt, like kind of in the creation of debt and debt markets and the whole, and that too, can be thought of at the individual level or at institutional level, and the micro and the macro. But I like that. So yeah, and that Harvey's a Marxist geographer, or also interdisciplinary, right? So it's, but those, I really like that. The line of thinking, like of environmental Marxism or green Marxism or Marxist informed ecology. I know that, there are other roots of environmental thinking and of ecological critique that maybe come from different directions, like deep ecology or, I don't know, conservation ethics or so that. But I think it's like that Marxist tradition is just so powerful in terms of allowing you to address the issue systematically. And if it's the case that capitalism and the effects of capitalism are real and have this impact in the world that they do, then you need to address that in your critique and theory. Otherwise, you're just it's almost impossible to properly diagnose and then treat, let's say, an environmental problem without having this level of analysis also there.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you're using capitalist mechanisms to solve the problems created by capitalism, what my work has shown is that it only makes the problem worse.
Yes.
And it only sort of shifts it around. But I wanted to come back to what you said about being different than like the deep ecology approach and these maybe like more than human approaches. And I actually see a relation with them because one of the things that my work has shown is what capitalism does, aside from exploiting people and the environment, is it changes the relationships in the spaces that it spreads. Right. So it's based on this philosophy that humans are rational thinkers, that we're individualistic and competitive. But what capitalism actually does is it introduces these parts of or not introduces, but I guess cultivates these parts of people, of who humans are, right? So humans are much more complex than just individualistic. We're also very communal minded. We're also very cooperative. We can be all these things. And it just it depends on the social and natural environments that we're brought up in that determines what sort of characteristics come out in us. And so what my work has shown this is my PhD work in Myanmar and Cambodia. And what I think it has shown is that when capitalism was introduced in the Cambodia case, in the dolphin conservation in Cambodia, it introduced this new value of the dolphin, a monetary value. And what that did was it introduced capitalist values in general. Like this dolphin is no more important because of the relation it has to people and the environment in the area. It's important because it has a transactional, it takes on a transactional meaning now. And so things increasingly become transactional, not just from the people to the dolphins, but then also with the tourists. And then also with their surrounding communities, everything becomes more individualistic, more transactional. And so for me, I think the deep ecology approach is critiquing very similar things as capitalism. And I think that capitalism is a way to explain how we got to this relational crises that I think we're seeing around the world. And by relational crisis, I mean we as humans are struggling to relate to each other anymore. We're struggling to have communities. We're struggling to feel as though we belong to a place. Very generally, I think this is a crisis that we're seeing. There's the loneliness epidemic. And I think this all, for me, stems back to the introduction of different values through capitalism. And Michel Foucault talks about how these sort of transformations happened in society with neoliberalism. So he's another theorist that I rely on a lot to understand not just that capitalism has changed the world around us, but how it has changed the world around us.
Yes. Yeah. And so like with Marx, you have a notion of alienation and of like the rupture between human society and nature, and the idea that, and you see this even in maybe like in Hegel or in other philosophical background, and then Marx maybe crystallizes it and says, yeah, this alienation that others are talking about with regards to modernity at large, or, like mercantile world order, is specific to capitalism. So, but that alienation, then you can think about in a number of different ways. Like, what are we alienated from? Are we alienated, like, are humans alienated from their rightful place in nature? That's one like macro view of it. But communities alienated from one another, individuals, families alienated, like the creation of the nuclear family structure and the atomized individual as a sort of alienating process that quantifies and makes discrete and fungible the whole fabric of society in a way that's consistent with the flow of capitalism. Like capitalism enacts this transformation of humans and of human societies in its own flow, and often that's very disruptive. I suppose maybe that's my question for you. It's like, I could see someone agreeing with the analysis descriptively. Like, I don't know if you know Jean Baudrillard or whatever, that he was kind of a compatriot of Foucault's, but with his view of the simulacrum, and often he sees himself as like a post-Marxist, or I shouldn't comment too much on it because I'm not an expert on it, but the idea is basically he would agree that, yes, we live in this world that's been fully shaped through consumer capitalism, and and we could add that it's transformed the planet. It's created a lot of death, extinctions. It's utterly alienated us from ourselves, or from tradition, and from what we were. But by and large, people enjoy it, and you should just kind of, like, you can't really say that it's wrong in a way. Like, from what position do you stand on? I guess maybe that's like a postmodern critique of Marxism. Like, do you have a God's eye view to say, well, who's to say that that's wrong? Like, a lot of people like the eating McDonald's and wearing blue jeans and watching documentaries about nature on their big screen TVs and eating their meat in styrofoam packaging and kind of having their lifestyles of accumulation. I mean, not a lot of people, but people in the first world for whom the system seems to be working. Like, it fattens up not just the capitalists, but whole bodies of the planet are. And it seems that people jump on that bandwagon. So it's like, I agree that it's wrong. That alienation, it's not just that it's destructive, but it's also negative. We should try to fight against it, and there's reasons to oppose it. But what are your reasons for that, I guess? And what do you say to the skeptic who's just like, yeah, but it's good?
I guess I would ask, how do you define what's good and what's working? Mm-hmm. Because, like, the things that you just listed, like, people are happy getting their hamburgers in styrofoam containers and whatever, but that's just a snapshot of their lives. And if we just observe what people are buying and what people are saying, that's still just a snapshot of, like, I guess what I'm getting at is, I think that what we lack, especially in Western science, is to think of things holistically. So they may say that they're happy sitting on their couch and eating McDonald's and getting fat and whatever, but what is their mental state saying? Like, what is happening to mental states across the world? Like, we have this loneliness epidemic, and we have the highest rates of addiction, the highest rates of depression, of anxiety than I think we ever have had, as long as we've been tracking these things. Right. So for me, that's the bigger picture. Yeah.
And it seems to be increasing also with younger generations, right? Like, or this, like the anxious generation, and the whole idea. And that then segues too with digital technology, with smartphones, with like and that driven by capitalism too, the kind of intrusion in more and more areas of our lives of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also you have to remember that the advertising industry is a multi-billion, actually, I think it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry in the US. And I don't know if this is still true, but at the time when I was taking a class with John Bellamy Foster at the University of Oregon, I think he said that the
Marxist
advertising industry was like, yeah, exactly. And he said that the advertising industry of the US was like 3 trillion at that time. So this is in like 2010, 2011. And advertising was tax deductible. So anything you spent on advertising, you could deduct from your taxes. So there was incentive to advertise. And we know too that behind the advertising industry is this huge like psychological analysis of people, and trying to understand how do we manipulate them into buying the things that we want them to buy and making them feel like they're happy about it. Right. So this happiness that people are feeling, it's not just sort of this byproduct of being able to consume. It's very intentional.
And manufactured, like this manufactured happiness.
Manufactured desire, manufactured happiness. And I don't know, maybe if people knew that that was going on, they'd still choose to have that manufactured happiness and manufactured desire. But I think the key is that most people don't know that that they're sort of being infiltrated with these advertisements and bombarded with advertisements now on social media, of course, and now being specifically targeted by the data that's being collected about them. So it's even worse now than it ever has been in history. But yeah, I wanted to go back to the alienation thing for a moment, because I'm now like thinking back to learning about what Marx said about alienation, and I only remember him talking about it on the individual level. Surely he talked about it on a more societal level as well. But from what I remember, he had, I think, 4 points of alienation and he was specifically talking about people who were forced to sell their labor after being removed from their land. And so, and about producing something basically on a factory line. So people were removed from producing their own means of subsistence on their own land to producing a tiny section of a tiny thing that is a product at the end after all of the people together are working on it. And so basically what he says is that people are alienated from the thing that they're making, because they're no longer making something from beginning to end. They're just making a small part of it. And they're also alienated from their own labor, which is, for Marx and many other theorists, it's a very essential part of human reality. It's an essential part of who we are. It's our labor, our ability to shape the world around us. And so when people lose that ability to see what their labor does, they lose that connection to themselves. They lose that understanding of themselves as someone who shapes the world around them. And then, of course, there's the alienation from the people who are buying the product. So the worker never sees the people who are buying the product. They never see anyone else along that sort of factory line. And so we're alienated from each other. We no longer, like, we go to the grocery store and we buy an apple, but we don't see the person who planted the seed, the person who cultivated the apple tree, the people who picked the apples and took it to the market. We don't see all these relations anymore. These are hidden by capitalism, and often intentionally, I think. And then the final one, of course, is nature, because you're only working on a small thing, a small part of whatever product you're making. And you don't see the nature that came from, and you're no longer interacting with nature in the way that we used to when we were more subsistence based.
Why don't we take a quick break, and then we can come back and maybe we can try to solve the problem. We can I think we've done a pretty good job of diagnosing the issue here.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're back. Sierra Deutsch, thanks for being here. We had talked about capitalism and about ecological and non-ecological polycrisis, and about the world as it is. And so what I want to ask you now is, like, how, given the scale and scope of the problem, and how, to continue with these concepts, like how firmly rooted capitalism is in this whole system, and how it seems to be accelerating and growing. As a human being, as a critic, as a theorist, as a scholar, as an expert, but also just as a human being, apart from your professional life, like, how do you remain motivated to continue to, like, go forward with this? Like, in the face of this, what is that spark that drives you to continue to learn more, to study more, not just to enter a state of despair and resignation, but to get up and want to go further, to go, like, up the peak of Kilimanjaro? No, like that. How do you continue?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's one that a lot of people are struggling with right now. I guess I'm up and down a lot, like where sometimes I'm just like, we're all screwed, basically. But I also, so one of the books that I've found really interesting by David Wentgrow and David Graeber, I always forget what it's called. It's like The History of Everything or something like that.
Yes, The Dawn of Everything.
The Dawn of Everything, thanks. Yeah. And so I guess you're familiar with the book, but they kind of talk about, for me, like one of the main messages is that capitalism killed creativity for human societies. So basically, we used to experiment with different political systems, with different social organizations, and even within the same tribes or the same groups, they would have a different social organization in the winter than they did in the summer, based on what was needed by the group at that point in time. But what happened with capitalism is that it's so embedded in our institutions now that we look around and what we see as capitalism, but to us it seems normal. It seems like a normal way to organize our social systems, a normal way to organize our economy, but it's really, really abnormal. And I think that one of the, especially if you look back through human history, because throughout human history, the economy was always meant to serve society. And that's what it did for most of human history until capitalism came along. And now, because of this profit motive, we have an economy that needs to be served by society in order to stay afloat, essentially. And so society is now subsumed to this economic system rather than the other way around. And we think that's normal, and that's the problem. And we think that there's no other way of doing things. There's this, it's so widely acknowledged that we refer to it as TINA, this idea that there is no alternative to capitalism. And I think it was Zizek who said something like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
Yes, yeah.
But yeah, so, and I think that's because, so this book brings that out. It's like, we've basically been stymied from being creative. So in capitalism, we're only creative to the extent that it can produce profit. We're no longer creative with the way we organize ourselves, with the way we want to do economy, with the way that we produce and distribute goods. And I believe that humans are incredibly creative, and that it's really a matter of tapping into that creativity again.
So even though we can't see, or if like Zizek was right about that, or that line of thinking, that it's almost unimaginable that we could live in a different way. It's so second nature to us. And not everywhere on the planet, but it's like a global phenomenon that, where globally there's this homogenization of society in line with capitalism in different forms, but such that it seems unthinkable that there could be something else. Not even that there would be concrete alternatives, but even just that humans are capable of living in a different way, and that there would and have been different ways of humans organizing ourselves that are other and that might be beneficial, and in many ways, seem to be better options for human beings. So do you think it's like that? What continues to drive you is the fact that there is, you are able to imagine that alternative?
In some ways I'm able to imagine that alternative, but it's difficult for me as well. But so I have sort of two lines that I go with in my research. One is the kind of borrowing from Foucault and looking at Foucault and because he was very in depth in describing how society was transformed into a neoliberal capitalist society. Right? And he was specifically looking at the US and Germany, but I think that in tracking how he describes that, you can sort of see how to reverse it all.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one sort of line that I go with. And the other is that there are many alternatives existing in the world already. And so we don't even really necessarily have to come up with them. We just have to seek them out and uplift them. And many of these alternatives come from Indigenous peoples and traditionally marginalized peoples in general and colonized peoples. And that, for me, I mean, people always get very upset with me for essentializing, but the fact of the matter is that you can broadly categorize, for example, the Western way of thought. It's very rationalistic. It's very, we use the scientific method. We use other methods of knowledge analysis as well. But one of the things that really characterizes us is we're very movable, especially U.S. Americans. And maybe it's not so much the case in Europe, but we move around. We don't really have a connection to place, not in the way that many Indigenous nations do. So with many Indigenous nations, and this is from my readings from Indigenous peoples. So this is not just me saying this. This is Indigenous peoples speaking through their writings. That Indigenous peoples are generally, that their definition is very contested as well. But generally speaking, one of the things that defines Indigenous peoples based on their own definition is that they're place-based. And that everything they do, everything about their culture, everything about their history is tied to place. They're inseparable from the places where they live. And it's really difficult for us, I think, as people who grew up in Western science and the Western sort of European tradition of thinking and knowing the world. I think it's really hard for us to imagine what that means and what it's like.
Yeah, because place and land, if they're, they can be thought about in terms of just their worth or their monetary worth in the economy of like, this can be sold for this, or this could be developed for these uses.
Right.
There's that, but it's also going back into Roman law, the distinction between persons and things, and this in kind of the mainstream Western tradition, this dissociation of the human being from the natural place it occupies, whether that's land, environment, community, and just to see things as transplantable in law, but also in ethics and on many levels. So that.
And existing in sort of a vacuum as well. And we talk a lot about disconnection in Western society, how we're disconnected from each other, how we're disconnected from nature. But Indigenous people's thinking, this would be a weird concept for them, because you can't disconnect from your surrounding. You can't disconnect from your land. You can't disconnect from each other, because you all rely on each other for life, for subsistence. People will be dead if they disconnected from each other and from the planet.
Yes. Yeah, there's like a sense of necessity of the interconnectedness. And maybe when that's more apparent and obvious to you, then it seems ridiculous to deny it.
Yeah.
But it kind of connects with what we were looking at before with how like in industrial society, we're alienated from our labor and from all those connections. So often like in the workplace, and then in just like one's entire waking life is often in this anonymous set of distributed relationships that are replaceable and that aren't really genuine. But if that's what then it seems bizarre that we would want to do that. I suppose. But with indigeneity and the concept of indigenous perspectives, and that's something I've approached in my work as well. And I find the concept of indigeneity and of indigenous theory helpful and useful as a way of sort of naming something in the broader context of histories of colonialism and of what it means to be indigenous and not indigenous, or the context of settler colonialism in indigenous identity. That's very tricky terminological ground because it's difficult to define things precisely, but nonetheless, it still seems helpful because it emphasizes these relationships and is kind of needed to bring voices into the conversation and to recognize that the mainline tradition of Western discourse has excluded a whole set, not just of ideas and intellectual traditions or literatures and cultures, but possibilities for living. But how do you like, maybe if you could put a point on that, like for you, how does the concept of indigeneity, like, do you find it slippery or because you're someone like, unlike me, you also have a lot of experience traveling the world, field work, often as an interdisciplinary theorist who's also a practitioner. I suppose, I don't know if you describe yourself as a practitioner, but just this, like, you know, when you're on the ground, do you find that this is also a helpful way of thinking about, you know, responses to the crisis? I guess maybe what I'm trying to get at is, like, theoretically, I think the concept has value, but do you also think that practically that there's something in terms of thinking, well, let's practically enact, I don't know, indigenous approaches, or try to think about what we could do in an indigenous framework? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And one of my projects is actually based on this idea, and it's called Flip It and Reverse It, transformative change through revisibilization of human nature relations, or human and human nature relations. And so what the project does is it's actually, the funding period has officially ended, but it brought some of my Native American colleagues over to Switzerland, and we worked together with Swiss nature conservation practitioners and a few of the other researchers from my group to think about what it would mean to revisibilize connections or revisibilize relations instead of reconnecting. And the goal was, it's called Flip It and Reverse It because the flip it comes from flipping the colonial relationship, where we're inviting indigenous peoples into Western lands and practices, to intervene in Western lands and practices rather than the other way around. And the reverse it is reversing both the colonial flow of knowledge and power and this imagined disconnection. And so, of course, there are many indigenous peoples who now sort of have Western viewpoints of binaries and consumerism. But I think that there's still something to a worldview that values relationality that can lead us through this crisis. And so in this particular case, what we did was we asked the Swiss nature conservation practitioners to present if they had some case studies that we could use to think through these ideas. So we looked at human-wolf interactions in Switzerland and the way that the concept of wilderness is taught in Swiss schools, like Swiss primary schools and in the general public.
Like in textbooks and in official governmental educational
can we rethink how
statements.
Wilderness is represented in education. And so we use these two case studies to think about the kind of future we would want in each case study. Like, what would it look like concretely if wilderness was taught in a way that that honored relationality and reciprocity and justice, and the same thing with human-wolf interactions. And so we very concretely defined what those futures would look like. So we take the human-wolf interactions case, for example. Concretely, one of the things that we would see is that the wolf would show up in less political articles, because it's very politicized here in Switzerland, as in many places that are dealing with the reintroduction of large carnivores.
Okay. And that has in part to do with kind of the ranching or the, the different sectors of the economy that are impacted. And
right. And it's also, it's a huge rural urban divide as well, because it's mainly people who are directly affected by the wolf's presence versus people who aren't really directly affected, but of course are concerned about it because it does affect the ecology of the nation, the biodiversity, and so on. So once we had these concrete ideas of what the future would look like, we then designed protocols, practices, and methods for like an action-based project that would get us to that future. So protocols are like general guidelines. So like making sure that, I'm trying to think what they are now. One of them that came up that we wouldn't have had without the inputs of our Indigenous colleagues was generational thinking. So one of the guidelines is when you're doing a project where you intend to have impact, like a positive, what we call transformative change towards a more healthy planet and society. One of the things that you should be thinking about is thinking generationally. So thinking about the knowledge of your ancestors, but at the same time thinking 7 generations ahead thinking about how your project is going to impact up to 7 generations ahead, and keeping that in mind.
Okay.
And then methods.
Yes.
Methods were just standard methods. So like whenever you come up with an idea for a project, that's one method. How you find your funding is a type of method, at least according to this guideline, these guides that we set out.
So those are like essential next steps, like for the project to be implemented, or how it could be.
Yeah, but so we made them to be very general. So they're also like essential things to keep in mind when doing any kind of an action project or any kind of, we call them transdisciplinary transformative change initiatives, where you're working together with other stakeholders and researchers to affect change on a particular topic.
Yeah.
And so and then practices are basically how you carry out the methods in order to align with the protocols. Okay.
And what would be some examples there of any recommendations?
So for example, one of the practices is to make sure everyone has an equal chance to speak. And so, for example, using a talking stick method. So when you have meetings, and one of the simplest things was to sit in circles at meetings instead of, for example, having someone up on a stage or someone at the head of a table. You sit in a circle because you're equalizing everyone. And then you have a talking stick that goes around. Each person gets a chance to speak if they want. If they don't, they pass the stick. And it's, there are some people who will continue to overtalk, but ideally they eventually learn that they don't need to do that. So then there are certain methods that you would carry out this practice. So for example, every time you have a meeting, this something you want to do is probably sit in circles and use a talking stick. Or every time you have, I don't know, like I don't have them in front of me right now. But if you're disseminating information, for example, making sure everyone's information is included in that.
I really like what you've just described with this project, or just, making this happen, what'd you say, flip it and reverse it, and being so intentional about how the conversations and maybe like the knowledge is formed, but not just theoretically, also laying out a roadmap of very concrete ideas. And a lot of this just makes so much sense that it helps, I think, illustrate why when we talk about like indigenous knowledge or kind of rooted in this, you don't have to think about it in some esoteric other way that otherizes what that knowledge is. Like, these are excellent ideas that can be brought into the fore, and a project like yours helps translate them, I suppose.
So I was going to mention one of the critiques that I got because it took me 5 proposals to get this grant, and eventually it was a grant that was meant to rapidly fund innovative ideas. But so I took on a lot of feedback before this final successful grant, and one of the things I hear a lot, and that that I think to a certain extent is true is that Indigenous knowledge is very localized because it's place-based.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is absolutely true and absolutely important to think about and to understand. But at the same time, the argument that I make is that even though the knowledge itself is place-based, it comes from a particular worldview, a way of viewing and understanding and thinking about the world. And that's what's important here for us to listen to, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for us to center. And it's not just a specific, it's not just about how we act in a specific context, but how we understand the world around us and how we do relationships, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe that there's something kind of general or like meta or kind of like a more universal dimension of what's going on there, that even though, and you could say that like all good ecological knowledge is place-based and specific and tied into the particular context with its history and the relationships there. But every place is a place, and one can apply place-based thinking in any number of places. And so the kind of, there's a sort of approach, maybe it has to do with relationality. But you know, maybe, and as a philosopher, that appeals to me, this idea that there are some general ideas here that you could tease out and that are at play. Because I feel that if you can't say that, the danger becomes, well, yes, everything is localized and tied to a place. And then that becomes very restrictive. And then it means, well, that can't be applied here. And it means then that if it's impossible to make any sort of general claims or to try to establish broader patterns of relevance, then you're never going to be able to address, say, a problem like capitalism that is big and spreads everywhere. It almost kind of neutralizes the power of different perspectives if we're just like, exactly, well, that works for them in their little corner of the world, but there's nothing we could learn from that.
Yep. And this is a critique I've also run into repeatedly working on neoliberalism and capitalism, is there's a lot of people try to argue, exactly that you can't extrapolate from a particular context and apply it elsewhere. But the fact is you can, if you have the right framework. And going back just for a minute to capitalism, Noel Castry and others have laid out what they talk about as neoliberalizations, which are processes of neoliberalism. And so they lay out kind of 1 to 10 processes, depending on the author, that are all happening sometimes simultaneously, sometimes chronologically, but it helps you to look at a place and say, which of these neoliberalization processes are happening here? And how does that relate to the patterns we're seeing globally? It's like privatization, for example, is one of these processes. And then you have like marketization, you have rolling back of social and environmental protections, and you have rolling out of policies that support big businesses and lobbyists. And so there are all these different processes, and that allows us to look at a place like Brazil, for example, is one place I looked at. And everyone, especially Brazilians, will tell you that Brazil is very unique and it can't be compared to anywhere else. And in many ways, that's true. But there are specific processes that are happening in Brazil that are also happening in other places in the world right now, the US being one of them, that are very similar. And I think it's really important to actually make that comparison to understand what it is that's like, sure, it's rolling out differently in different contexts, but what is the connection here?
Yes. And so thinking holistically, internationally, globally, interdisciplinarily, like, I don't know. It's like, it seems like that as even a characterization of you as a person and as a theorist, like you want to recognize and attend to the broader connections. Right. Like you want to be open and have the biggest kind of field. And also maybe that's also about inequality and exclusion. But I appreciate that about you, and it's neat to hear that laid out.
And I do, I mean, I attend to local specifics as well, but then I connect them to broader global patterns as a way of understanding how to grapple with them. And and also as a way to understand what possible solutions could be. Because again, if we're only looking at the context, then we're only looking at the symptoms, and we're only dealing with the symptoms. We also need to look at the broader global patterns, which are the roots.
Yeah, and it's like maybe we need both. There's like, and that's part of that
definitely.
The holistic analysis that attend to particular contexts. See these as symptomatic. So like the example you gave with the dolphins in Myanmar, right? And but there's any number of cases, or we talked about Kilimanjaro and like the ecology and economy there. But you could focus on any of these spaces, and you need that to see concretely how things do play out, and to tell the story of that, and to have your approach and your analysis rooted in the real. But at the same time, then from that, it's not that you can exactly extrapolate, but that there's an intimate relationship. To understand what's going on in that context, you need the broader view. It can't just be entirely localized.
Exactly.
Kind of a small discrete case study. You lose the forest for the trees. But at the same time, you can be overly dispersed in the forest and overly general. And often, I mean, philosophy is a discipline, but other disciplines, every discipline has its own version of this. We're kind of a retreat into abstract theory. And often there's reasons to do that, and there's conversations to be had there, and there's work that can be done there. But if it's sort of detethered from that concrete specific, then I don't know. I guess it's incomplete, and it's not going to be able to come back and close the circle and effectively change the concrete again. It just remains theoretical, and in a certain sense, powerless.
Yeah, exactly.
But let me ask you then, we've come to the point where I'll ask you about 3 recommendations, if you have them. So book, film, album, any of those 3, or other genres, mix and match. What do you have to share for us? Or share with us?
This is a really, really hard task for me. I think I struggled most with the album, because I don't really choose my music so much. Like I listen to it on Pandora, for example. Yeah. So there's not really any particular albums that I seek out. But one song in particular stuck out and sticks out to me often, and that is 07's Waiting Line.
Okay. Never heard of it.
And I'm actually not a lyric person. Like usually I just listen, I get into the beat of a song. I don't really listen to the lyrics as much, but this particular song, the lyrics really speak to me. Yeah. But it's basically about kind of looking around you and feeling like no one is understanding what's happening in the world around you. And like everyone's just kind of like in the waiting line, like not really registering the depth of the craziness of the world around them.
Okay. So this is a very apropos song to our conversation.
The book was much easier. So this is Cannibal Capitalism by Nancy Fraser. And I think it's for me, at least, it was a really good summary of capitalism as the root causes to the polycrisis. One of the things I didn't like about it is that she doesn't use a lot of citations where she should be. But at the same time, I guess it's Nancy Fraser. She's really well known in political economy. So I think she could get away with it. But I think anyone else who tried to write this book, even as good as it is, would have struggled to get away with not using citations in a lot of cases. Okay.
Just kind of supporting your work in the sense of saying, well, and these others have said something similar and here's why, and to kind of
I mean, for example, she talks about David Harvey's spatiotemporal fixes, but I think she doesn't really mention that it's coming from him. So things like that, where there are some theories that she presents that are really well known by political economists, but then she doesn't cite the political economists who presented them in the first place. So it was just a little weird to me, but it's still a good book.
Okay, and maybe more readable for that reason. That's a weird thing about books like that sometimes.
More readable. I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, maybe I should give a push for just Indigenous writers in general, because I think in some ways they're much more interesting to read, because they grab you more holistically, I guess. They're not just speaking to your brain, they're speaking to your body and your heart. So like Winona LaDuke is another great one. And Kyle Powys Whyte. Taiaiake Alfred, who wrote Wasase.
Okay.
Yeah, those are the main ones. And I have a quote pulled up from Kyle Powys Whyte that I thought might be good to finish with, because you were asking me about hope, and this is one of the things that gives me hope. So should I go ahead with that?
Please, yeah. Why don't you take us out? So, yeah, we'll end with that, and I'll say, Sarah, thanks so much for making time for this conversation. It was really interesting and fulfilling, and we'll have to do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thanks so much. And next time I want to talk to you more about your research.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that's not why
I'll put it in
doing
quotation
podcast,
marks,
but
research now, you know what I mean? But yeah. There's stuff we could talk about.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the quote is, portrayals of the Anthropocene period are often dystopian or post-apocalyptic narratives of climate crises that will leave humans in horrific science fiction scenarios. Such narratives can erase certain populations, such as Indigenous peoples, who approach climate change having already been through transformations of their societies induced by colonial violence. So just sort of saying, like, there are answers out there. There are people with those answers. But in order to hear those answers, some of us need to step aside and let them sort of emerge.
The Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast is a co-production of Deadbeat Media and the Museum Hegel-Haus Stuttgart. For more Deadbeat content and to chip in to keep the channel going, check us out at deadbeatphilosophy.substack.com. For more about the Museum Hegel-Haus, check out hegelhaus.de. That's HEGEL-HAUS.de. Adios and auf Wiedersehen.